Now then, I was tempted, I have to admit, I was tempted to kick off this morning's debate by asking if Scotland's First Minister would do better to resign. But his determination to cling to power, however grim the consequences, remind me of another contemporary leader who, like Yousaf, has yet to win a mandate from the people, who perhaps is representative of a party that's been in power too long. And yes, I'm thinking of Rishi Sunak. So the question I'm going to kick off with this morning that I want you to wrestle with is, are Hamza Yusefs and Rishi Sunak, what happens when one party's been in charge, running the shop almost unchallenged for way, way too long? And if you are minded to agree with that assertion, then I guess we should spare a thought for Vaughan Gething, the Welsh First Minister, because Labour has now been in power, I think, in Wales for 25 years, something like that. Anyway, Hamza Yusefs and Rishi Sunak, both men have their qualities, their flaws, political views. The fact that neither have won a mandate from the people, I suggest, speaks volumes. I read one Tory supporting paper, I think the Times yesterday, speculating that Yousaf wouldn't resign because no one in Scotland could tolerate having a second unelected leader foisted on the plebs. Hello? Don't they know who's holed up in number 10 down here? Anyway, if you believe what you read in the right-wing press, you'll know that many Tory MPs are openly plotting to remove Rishi Sunak before the next election, whenever that may be, and therefore potentially give us a third leader without a mandate from you and I, the voters. Both Yousaf and Sunak, one might argue, really only have themselves to blame for the situation they find themselves, staring into the political abyss, wondering how to manage what's left of their political careers. Sunak, I would argue, for failing to deliver on his key pledges. Yousaf for exposing himself to a vote of no confidence by falling out with the SNP's Green partners in government. And there's plenty more gone wrong. I mean, the SNP's Hate Crime Act, as callers were saying to Ollie just a few minutes ago, that's been a risible disaster, like almost everything our Prime Minister down here touches in Westminster. Both men have flip-flopped on net zero ambitions. They're both tanking in the opinion polls, as are their respective parties. A week back, the Scottish First Minister's net approval rating dropped close to that of Rishi Sunak. I think Yousaf shed 15 points and fell to minus 32%, while Prime Minister Rishi Sunak actually increased his rating from an historic low of minus 45% to a slightly less dismal minus 35%. This was last weekend. And what I want to hear from you this morning, ladies and gentlemen, is whether it's the man that's the problem. I don't even know if you're allowed to say a man in Scotland anymore. I hope so. No offence intended anyway. But is it the politician, the individual, that is the problem here? Or is it, as I suspect, more to do with their respective parties being in power too long? What, 14 years for the Tories? It's I think 17 years, isn't it, for the SNP? My generation has witnessed two Westminster parties hold power over three lengthy periods. The Tories, with Thatcher and Major, they covered 18 years, from 79 to 97. Labour from 97 to 2010 with Blair and a bit of Brown. And then the last 14 years of the Tories, both in coalition and flying solo. Apart from, I suppose, Macmillan in the 1950s, there hasn't been such a long run of one party holding power for so long in the last 120 years or so. John Major, he presided over a collapse in party discipline, sleaze oozing from every corner of Tory Westminster. Labour, they enjoyed more than 10 years of fair weather economically speaking, but failed to spread that good cheer to its traditional voting bases, and they ended up paying the price in subsequent polls for taking that red wall support for granted. But after their parties have been in power for 14 years and 17 years respectively, I'm not surprised Sunak and Yousaf are on the ropes. Indeed, it would be pretty astonishing, I think, for either man to be knocking it in the back of the net, politically speaking, when polls show a growing dissatisfaction, not just with them as individuals, but for their parties too. I think Labour 2 weeks ago were polling ahead of the SNP for the first time in nigh on a decade. And as we know, Labour leading the Tories by some margin down here across the country. So I suppose we one of the things we might all agree on is we deserve an election. But for Yousaf and Sunak, is it their personality, is it their individuality that's the problem, or their parties being in power too long? 0345 6060 973 is the number. Well, Alan Zaginski is LBC Scotland's correspondent, and I'm delighted to say I'm speaking to him first. Morning, Alan. Perhaps you could explain why Yousaf finds himself in such a pickle today.
Yes, well, a pickle is an understatement, isn't it? Because his future is now very much hanging in the balance. I think just to briefly touch on what you say there, this goes back further than the week of chaos that we've had when he came into his role a year ago. He really was taking on a bit of a poison chalice. I think that would be fair to argue. He was taking over the SNP party that was more divided than it had been perhaps in any time in its history. Nicola Sturgeon, Alex Salmond's famous falling out, of course, the independence movement at a crossroads. And again, the alliance with the Greens was already on the ropes. Differences, cracks were starting to emerge in terms of climate change targets, in terms of gender recognition reforms as well. So this has gone on for a while, but in the last weeks, well, certainly in the last 2 days, Matthew, it has been chaotic in the Scottish Parliament. We've had screeching U-turns from Hamza Yusefs. We've had bitter press conferences. We even had an MSP crying on the radio last night. And as I say, Hamza Yusefs, whose job remains on a knife edge, and his fate is seemingly still in the hands of Alex Salmond's Alaba party. There's an irony in there, isn't there? Because their one MSP, Ash Regan, is still placed to have the deciding vote in a no confidence motion against him to be heard next week. That's after the Greens that he chucked out of government said that they would back it. But not only has Hamza Yusuf told me yesterday, I spoke to him in Dundee, that he's prepared to fight this motion, that he's not even thought about resigning beforehand. He's actually suggested that this is all more of a Hollywood bubble story. Have a listen to what he told me.
I'm out here delivering on the priorities of the people, £80 million towards affordable housing, while the opposition are just playing silly political games.
But you're talking about homes. It seems that the entirety of Scotland is talking about your position. How can you say you've not even considered it overnight?
I don't think that's actually the case. I think most people are worried about the cost of living crisis. They're worried about health. They're worried about housing. They're worried about supporting businesses. That's what they're worried about and concerned about, not about political games from the opposition. So I'll let them play the games that they're going to play. But it's also why I've written to we'll be writing to all the party leaders that are represented in the Scottish Parliament to say to them, let's meet, let's discuss how we get minority government to work.
So it seems his big plan there then to get through this vote, Matthew, is to write to the party leaders, see if he can change their minds. I'd be amazed if the Greens did that now after how angry they were. Will Alaba's Ash Regan? Remains to be seen, but he would need to offer her something. But in doing so, that might annoy his own MSPs to the point that they then turn against him. What I can tell you is Labour, the Lib Dems, they are very unlikely to be swayed, and so are the Conservatives. Here's their leader, Douglas Ross.
The only letter I want to see from Hamza Yusuf is one announcing his resignation. His obsession with independence has left our economy and public services worse off. The Scottish Conservative vote of no confidence in Hamza Yusuf will go ahead, and my party is urging every MSP disillusioned with his dismal leadership to back it.
And worth just mentioning as well, Matthew, that there is actually a second motion of no confidence that's been brought by Labour, not just in Hamza Yusuf, but in his entire government. And while that's less likely to pass, if it were to, that could domino us into staring down the barrel of 2 elections in Scotland in just 1 year.
Alan Zazinski, thank you very much for that. Listening to that is Neil Harvey MP, the Alaba Party Westminster leader, MP for Kirkcaldy. Good morning to you, Neil.
Good morning, Matthew.
Of the 2 motions that he faces, let's say we'll just go for the first one, just his position. If he was to go, do you think the Scottish people would tolerate having another leader given to them without a mandate, without a vote from the people?
I think that would be a very difficult argument to win in terms of the public debate. But it's difficult to predict. I think that the assertion from Hamza Yusuf in the tape he played a moment ago, that no one in Scotland is talking about this as a Hollywood bubble story is so far removed from the truth of the matter. It's quite staggering. I mean, this is the talk of Scotland. So the idea given everything that's happened in the year since Nicola Sturgeon resigned. And I have some sympathy for Hamza Yusuf in some respects. He's inherited the consequences of many poor decisions that were made by the former First Minister, who was more obsessed with headlines than the detail of policy and delivery. And so, he's not exactly had an easy run of it in the first year, but he's got himself into a real difficult place.
Is it
now?
Is it? 'Cause I don't want to make it out too much my own personal obsession, but I am fascinated by long periods of power because my generation, our generation, we've seen a lot of it in the UK.
Yeah.
Do you think? And obviously, going to have a view about the SNP because of the party you represent. But do you think this is more symptomatic of a party that's been in power too long? That just like the Tories are having down south, just like previous Labour administrations and previous Tory Westminster governments when they've had long periods in power, it just seems inevitably things go wrong, badly wrong.
Well, there's always an ebb and flow to politics. That's just a matter of fact. And we have had long periods in both in Scotland and in the rest of the UK where parties have had protracted periods of government. Now, a protracted period of government's great when you're able to deliver on your commitments, but when you take your eye off the ball and you lose sight of what it is you were elected to deliver on, and in this case, I would disagree with Douglas Ross's comments about the SNP being obsessed with independence. Well, for many people in the SNP, in the Alpha Party and in the wider independence movement, that obsession has absolutely, there's no evidence of that. And that's one of the key issues that we've raised with the SNP, or rather Ash Regan has raised directly with the First Minister in our letter, which is to put some focus onto that, because the whole independence project requires the delivery of a competent government and competent governance, and that's something that's been sadly lacking over the last number of years. So we'd like to see that. We're also very concerned about the Green Party's influence over gender identity politics and the way the Scottish Government, particularly Nicola Sturgeon, was very supportive of that and was completely unwilling to listen to critical voices.
Let me ask you this now, just very briefly. Let's say he loses a vote of no confidence. Should we then see an election in Scotland? Should that be the natural consequence?
I think it's very difficult to see a circumstance where that isn't the result of the First Minister resigning.
Okay.
In a way that is convincing. So, for example, the Greens are saying last night, Ross Greer, one of the Green Party MSPs, was saying that they're holding out for the removal of Hamza Yusef and the installation of a new Green compliant SNP MSP as a First Minister. I don't think the Scottish public will tolerate that. That's for one thing.
This is what. God, I have to leave it there as time's running away. But what I find so fascinating, of course, is this conversation. You can't have it without thinking about what's been happening down in Westminster, where we have had another unelected Prime Minister foisted on us without going to the country.